Okay, I want to talk about why art is special. And I think a big reason is that art can open our minds. It can allow us to criticize things. It can lead us to new understandings. Artists, in their practice, are able to take something and to decompose it, to disaggregate it, to fragment it, and to make something new and interesting and wonderful out of it. I think art is inherently democratic because it fosters diversity of expression, diversity of opinion. Art is also a refuge. You should have seen me when I was 16. I was a shy, gaunt, pale, hollow-eyed, sunken-chested, antisocial teenager. I was also quite depressed for a number of years. But art was something special that I had. It was a refuge for me, something up my sleeve that I could retreat into, and it helped me through some very difficult times. Here's a drawing from my high school years, which signaled the creation of an inner world, the world of the imagination. The paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, Goya the Surrealists, and what the fascists of World War II called degenerate art inspired me and showed me that life and humanity was more complex, more diverse, and richer than the rather shallow and rigid order that some individuals or institutions would try and impose upon us. I love comics and sometimes draw in a comic book fashion. Indeed, I love other so-called low forms of popular culture. Things like old school horror movies, heavy metal music, and fantasy novels nurtured that inner world for me. Here's a drawing of my grandmother, which I made on a trip to India. Having been to art school, I became very interested in portraiture. She was born in a world and an age that is completely different to mine, but I spent many hours drawing her, talking to her, and getting to know something of that world. I look with great fondness on these drawings. I drew them with great love and affection, and they're very precious to me because they encompass the relationship that I formed with her. It was the only time that I got to know my grandmother. So I think art can encompass something of the complexity and the richness of life. It can express our relationships with others. And art also offers possibilities. And it's a sense of the possibility of art that I've sought to bring to the organisation that we founded in late 2010 called the Refugee Art Project. We're a small group of friends who went into the Villawood Detention Centre to hold art classes for refugees who are held there. Now, for most of them, they'd never made art before in their lives, but this was a good chance for them to express something of their feelings and experiences. With the works produced from our classes, we then curated public exhibitions. But before I talk more about the work and the exhibitions, a word of context is in order. Australia only gets a fraction of the world's refugee flows, and yet we have a policy of mandatory detention for everyone who arrives at our shores by boat and claims asylum. The problem with detention centres, such as the one pictured, is that people will remain in them for months and then years. The average time for our participants is 2 years or more in detention. Despite signing the United Nations Refugee Convention, Australia is the only country in the world, that does not put a limit on the amount of time refugees can be kept in detention. This harsh policy reflects a very negative political discourse towards refugees. Our politicians through the years have often referred to them as illegals, as unlawful entries, as queue jumpers, and have tried to associate them wrongly, I think, with criminals and terrorists. All of this creates a negative perception in the public mind, and it's very hard to combat that negative perception. One reason is that the media are not allowed into our detention centres. Asylum seekers have no access to the channels of communication that could give them a public voice. Here's an artwork by a refugee from Iran who was in the Darwin Detention Centre, and I think it touches on the problem of representation perfectly. He's depicted the refugee as a passive sheep behind a fence, but who is being seen or visualized in the public sphere as a howling wolf, as something threatening, as something to be feared. So the point of our organisation was to take artworks by refugees and to display them to the public, which is to present alternative points of view, alternative ideas, alternative narratives to the overwhelmingly negative, politically and media-driven images of refugees. A simple drawing can say a lot. It can cut across cultural, linguistic, religious, and national boundaries. Most of our participants have come from such countries as Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Burma, and Sri Lanka, amongst others. And many of them have painted and drawn about the conflicts from which they've fled. Here is a painting by a Sri Lankan Tamil asylum seeker who was in the Villawood Detention Centre. It depicts the events of the Sri Lankan War of 2009. We receive many such images which show soldiers attacking and killing civilians, which chimes with a UN estimate that up to 40,000 civilians might have been killed during the conflict. There were a recorded 30 attacks by the Sri Lankan army on hospitals. So I think these paintings show us the very real hell that these people have endured and survived. Here is an image by an Iranian refugee referring to the persecution and imprisonment of political opponents in Iran. Here's an image by a Hazara Afghan. We receive many images by Hazaras, who are a minority in Afghanistan, depicting the Taliban and other hostile militias who've persecuted them down the years. So from these circumstances comes the desire to get out, to escape, to pay a people smuggler and to find passage to Indonesia, from where to board a ship to take one from Indonesia to Australian shores. And some of our participants have referred to the boat journey. This is a painting by a Sri Lankan Tamil refugee showing a boat filled with asylum seekers arriving at its destination of Christmas Island. Once arrived, refugees are then taken into Australian custody, and detention represents the next stage of their journey. As I said, people often spend up to 1 or 2 years or more in detention, during which time they live in a state of chronic anxiety and uncertainty. They don't know whether they'll be rejected by the Australian courts and sent back to the country from which they've fled. Many are fearful as well for the safety of the families they've left behind. Most refugees are young men because they were the most likely to be targeted by persecuting regimes, such as one finds in Iran or the Taliban, but they've left behind wives and children, parents and grandparents, often they are exposed to situations of danger. Now we have images that refer to the family members left behind. This is a drawing by an Afghan female refugee. It's been copied from a photograph and it depicts her son, who she hadn't seen in 3 years. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about 1 or 2 of the individuals we've met and their works. This is a painting by Alvi Fuddle. Alvi Fuddle has been in the Villawood Detention Centre for over 4 years, making his one of the longest running cases of indefinite detention. I think his paintings are wonderful for 2 reasons. Well, they're interesting for 2 reasons. On one hand, he confronts the issue of mental illness, which he has seen and experienced up close during his time in Villawood. Alvi has witnessed acts of self-harm and suicide which have deeply traumatised him and affected his psychological health. And it's a point worth making that despite the traumas people undergo in the countries from which they've fled, their experience of detention often adds a whole new layer of trauma and mental illness which they would otherwise not acquire. On the other hand, I think Alvi's paintings represent his strength and resistance to the conditions that have been imposed upon him. It's worth pointing out that these images were painted with instant coffee powder, which has been mixed up with water and then painted onto the page. The technique was begun by an Iraqi detainee who had no access to paint at the time, so he developed it and then taught it to Alvi Fuddle. The recourse to food is interesting, I think, in this case, because it shows the ingenuity and the innovation of people who don't have access to adequate art materials. Here is another example of food art by an Iranian detainee named Majid Rabet. He's made the flour and the leaves from cheese, which he's finely cut and then glued to a plastic plate. The stalk and the decorative border are made from instant 5-minute noodles, so all of the materials here, except for paint and glue, have been taken from the communal kitchen. He also wanted to paint at one point, but had no brushes, so he made his own, again taking materials from the kitchen. So here we see a paintbrush and palette knife made from a plastic fork, plastic cutlery. The smaller brush is made from a radio antenna, and the hairs of these brushes were actually taken from a cat, which goes in and out of the detention centre. Now, before you get worried, I'll just point out the cat wasn't harmed in this process. In fact, the two remained very close and are very affectionate to one another. He was an engineer and an inventor. He wanted to keep busy during the time he was in detention, which lasted for 2 years. But he had no tools. Detention is much like prison. They're not allowed access to certain things. They're not allowed access to sharp objects. They don't use steel cutlery. They aren't given any glass. So he made his own tools from scrap that he found within the centre. In the centre we see a hammer here, which he's made from an old steel bolt, some chopsticks, which is wound up tightly with some string and tape. To one side we see a homemade screwdriver made from an old coat hanger. To the other we see an electrical tester pen. I've got no idea how he made it, but it's using an old pen and some electrical parts. And with these tools he got hold of an old DVD player within the centre and transformed it into this, which is an electric massage machine. He's sewn a motor into the fabric, which is from a pair of old jeans, which has Velcro attached to it. You strap the fabric around your arm or leg, you flick the switch, and it vibrates at 2 levels of intensity. So it's the perfect tonic after a hard day if you've got sore limbs. I think these works reflect something of the diversity of expression and feeling amongst refugees, and in a sense, they resist a singular narrative where refugees are concerned. Such work is interesting because it represents an attempt to transcend the detainee's environment, to transform food or found objects into works of creative and aesthetic pleasure. On the subject of the diversity of expression that we received, of particular interest are works which reflect Australian themes. We received a number of drawings of koalas, kangaroos, the Sydney Opera House, and so on. These images seem to reflect the aspiration and the desire of refugees to become Australian, which is to start a new life in security and safety. This homemade carpet, made by an Afghan refugee who was in the Wipa detention centre in North Queensland, represents, or I think refers to Australia in this way. One needs to remember the importance of carpet making in Afghan culture. Carpets are an important part of the aesthetic experience of everyday life, whether it's in the mosque or in the home. But in this case, he's depicted an image of a map of Australia. I think it's a very poignant and lovely reflection on the desire to find acceptance and belonging in this country. Indeed, if there's a theme that runs through the works we received, it is the desire to be heard and understood and to be treated with dignity and respect. So with the works we've received, we then curated our first exhibition, which took place in 2011 in Sydney's Morrie Gallery. As you can see, we had a good turnout on the opening night, so it was successful in that context. But it was also a sad night, not least because over 90% of the people who'd made the artworks couldn't be present. They were in the Villawood Detention Centre or in other detention centres, wondering how the night would go. Nonetheless, the exhibition did create something of a bridge between people in detention and people in the community, and this happened through the internet, through Facebook and social networking websites. So, for instance, this is an image from the Facebook wall of Alvi Fuddle. He couldn't be at the show, but friends of his have taken pictures of themselves and others in front of his works. They've photographed his pictures on the wall and they've posted them on his Facebook wall. He was very appreciative of this, and he also responded to the comments that people were making about his work. So a dialogue ensued about the work, but on Facebook. Asylum seekers are given limited access to the internet, and Facebook is one of their only portals to the outside world. You'll notice that above the album, a friend has written, "Alvi, you're a star. You're a star, everyone's talking about your work. We wish you were here, we wish you were with us at your own exhibition opening." So I think art can do lots of things. It's a vehicle for self-development, for personal expression, for the creation of inner worlds. It also encompasses and expresses our relationships with others. But in the hands of asylum seekers, people who are kept away from the public and the media, I think art is a very powerful tool. It can lend them a voice and help them to express something of their agency. In the hands of asylum seekers in our detention centres who are locked up for years on end, we hope that art such as this can prompt a second thought, prompting people to think twice and to think morally about the issue of refugees. Thanks very much.